So let's consider the problem of finding the greatest common divisor of two numbers. Suppose d is the GCD. We determined that if a divided by b is q with remainder r, then d divides the remainder. While this is useful, it might not be usable. For example, suppose we wanted to find the GCD of 3,111 and 797. We find that 3111 divided by 797 is 3 with remainder 720. So the greatest common divisor of the two numbers will be a divisor of 720. Unfortunately, 720 has a lot of divisors. So is there a way we can find the greatest common divisor more easily? At this point, here's an obligatory math joke. How many mathematicians does it take to screw in a light bulb? 1. They give it to a left-handed electrician, thereby reducing it to the previous joke. This explains two things. First, why HBO isn't returning my calls, but more importantly, how mathematicians approach problems. In this case, our original question was, find the GCD of two numbers. And a mathematical approach is, can we answer it by finding the GCD of two other numbers? So suppose d is the greatest common divisor of a and b. So from a divided by b equals q with remainder r, we have, and so d also divides r. And so d divides a, b, and r. Now consider another greatest common divisor. We have three numbers on the table, a, b, and r, so how about the greatest common divisor of b and r? Now we know d prime divides b, d prime divides r, and again from our equation we find that d prime also divides a. Now since d is the greatest common divisor of a and b, but d prime also divides a and b, then d prime must be less than or equal to the greatest common divisor. And likewise, since d prime is the greatest common divisor of b and r, but d also divides b and r, then d must be less than or equal to d prime. And because d prime must be less than or equal to d, and d must be less than or equal to d prime, the only possibility is that d and d prime are the same. And this gives us an important lemma. Suppose a divided by b is some quotient with remainder r. Then the greatest common divisor of the two numbers is also the greatest common divisor of the b and the remainder. And this gives us a way forward. We found that 3111 divided by 797 is 3 with remainder 720, and our lemma tells us that the greatest common divisor of the original numbers is also the greatest common divisor of one of them and the remainder. But to find this remainder 720, we divided our two numbers. So let's divide 797 by 720 to get, and so our lemma again tells us the greatest common divisor of these two numbers is the greatest common divisor of these two numbers. And we can continue to find remainders where a divisor becomes the next dividend and a remainder becomes the next divisor. So let's try that. So we'll divide to get a quotient and remainder. We don't actually care about the quotient. But then our old divisor becomes the new dividend, our old remainder becomes the new divisor, and we divide to get a quotient and remainder. So now the old divisor becomes the new dividend, the old remainder becomes the new divisor, and we divide to get a quotient and remainder. The old divisor becomes the new dividend, the old remainder becomes the new divisor, and we divide to get quotient and remainder, and again, and again. And our work gives us a cascading sequence of greatest common divisors, all of which are equal to each other. Now, note that while we haven't actually found the greatest common divisor, we've reduced it to a much simpler problem, because the greatest common divisor of the last two numbers is 1. So let's try to find the greatest common divisor of these two. So we'll divide to get a quotient and remainder. The old divisor becomes the new dividend. The old remainder becomes the new divisor. And we divide to get quotient and remainder. And again, and again, and again. And because our remainder here is 0, we can't divide any further. So once again, our theorem gives us this cascading sequence of greatest common divisors. But notice that any number divides 0. So our greatest common divisor will be the greatest number that also divides 36, which is going to be 36. And so the greatest common divisor of the two numbers is 36.